Welcome everybody to my podcast, Big Little Small Talk. I'm Megan O'Hara-Sullivan and I love to talk, but I also love to listen. If you're new here, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello everyone, you're with me, Megan O'Hara-Sullivan, and we're on Big Little Small Talk. Today my guest on Big Little Small Talk is Peter Frazer, and Peter Frazer is a bush poet. I heard Peter speaking some poetry at the Bull's Head Inn a couple of weekends ago, and he delivered his poetry with such flair and such wonder that I knew that I needed him as a guest on Big Little Small Talk. So welcome, Peter, to Big Little Small Talk.
Good afternoon, Megan. How are you?
Yes, well, now, what constitutes bush poetry? Tell me that.
Well, the term bush poetry is an interesting term. Today's interpretation of bush poetry, promoted by the Australian Bush Poets Association, is it's poetry that rhymes and has good metre and verse, but basically it's poetry about the Australian way of life. City or country, it's the Australian way of life.
And I did read that it had to have metre and rhyme, and sometimes it helps to be funny or a bit rude as well. And it's about the performance as much as the words themselves. If you write them on a page, they're sometimes a bit flat.
Yeah. I like to say poetry is painting pictures with words, and most poets you can recite, or you can read, or you can perform. And if it's a poet that stirs your emotion and you can perform it in such a way to elicit an emotion in the listener, then I think that's where art comes into it and the painting of a picture.
Now, forgive my ignorance, but tell me what metre is.
Metre is basically the pace. So it might be 3 words, pause, 3 words, pause. So the lines tend to be da da da, da da da. So it's a uniform rhythm, as opposed to some poetry which could say, I went down the road yesterday and the day after I came back again. And it doesn't necessarily have a rhythm and it doesn't have a rhyme, which is okay for that genre of poetry. So it's more about rhythm.
It's about rhythm.
Yeah.
Now, you said it's about the Australian way of life, and, you know, really famous bush poets like Banjo Paterson and Henry Lawson, they wrote about things like bushrangers, droughts, droving, those sorts of things. What about contemporary bush poets? What sort of things are they writing about?
Well, obviously there are quite often poems written about the outback way of life still, but there are just as many poems about runaway shopping trolleys, a bad shopping experience. I've got one I wrote recently about a lady's unfortunate encounter with a reptile at a country race meeting. So yes, it's wide-ranging now. Some people have trouble with backing a caravan or trailer. Again, it's the Australian sense of humour and the Australian way of life that portrayed more and more.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you think mostly, is there a difference, ask you this question, is there a difference between bush poetry and bush ballads?
Not really. I think the term ballad is probably more of a hangover from days gone by. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe a ballad told a story and bush poetry tells a story. It's just the difference with the poetry itself is that you've got a number of definite styles of poetry. There's, traditional English, European, then there's the Elizabethan poetry, Shakespeare's era and things like that. Today we've got rap and slam, which is a different generation coming through again. And you've got the Japanese haiku, sorry, I always get that wrong, which is very short, concise, but they're all using the word to elicit an image or a meaning or an emotion.
So do you think mostly with the bush poetry mostly it's about humour? Do you think mostly it's a...
No, well, I like to try and write humour, and I think the Australian sense of humour lends its way to bush poetry. But that said, a lot of bush poetry people accuse and say, oh, it's so sad. And you look at Banjo Patterson's and Henry Lawson's, a lot of theirs, when you analyse it, were quite sad poems, but they were reflective too of the times that they were going through. And a lot of poems too can be politically based. I've written a few of those over the years, and my employer at the time used to say, that's a good poem, but don't push it.
All right, well, with that, we might dive straight in. You've given me an opening. You know I love politics.
Yep.
So can you recite for me your one of your political poems for me?
I wrote this some years ago, and I just entitled it The Tree. The twisted gum tree beckoned, and a whispered voice then said, come sit with me, young Aussie, here beside this railway shed. I'll share with you my memories of the things that I have seen in times of flood and bushfire, of drought and emerald green. The dark-skinned folk shared my shade in the dream time long ago, till the white man came and settled here and Barcaldine town did grow. Then the men of God sought shelter here as they beat their tambourine, and the railway workers of yesteryear so often here were seen. Then came, of course, the angry years with the mighty shearers' strike, when the shearing teams lay down their shears and mustered here to fight. They called for fairer wages as they shore the golden fleece, and for the first time since Eureka, civilians fought police. To St. Helena some were sent to silence all their cries, and those angry years beneath my boughs saw the Labour Party rise. Be it politics or religion, I've heard it all, you see. For some, I'm the tree of knowledge. For some, the Alleluia tree.
Beautiful. So you not only read bush poetry, you write bush poetry.
Yes, yeah.
And you have a group here in Toowoomba called the Bush...
Toowoomba Bush Poets, we call ourselves.
So tell me about the Toowoomba Bush Poets.
Okay, well, it's a small group that came together probably about three and a half years ago, just before COVID. And it's just a group of us that were interested in poetry, Australian bush poetry in particular, but not necessarily exclusively that. And some of us write, like myself. Others love reading or reciting traditional poems. And a number of people come along just to listen because they enjoy that. And we meet once a month in the Toowoomba Library meeting rooms on the second Saturday of each month between 10 and 12. It's all very informal. We have a cup of coffee or tea and a few biscuits. I tend to bake some Arnott Scotch finger biscuits. We encourage people just to come along and either sit, or if they have a poem. And what I particularly like finding is people, they'll say, my father wrote a poem, or my mother wrote a poem, or my grandmother. Or even they did it, but quite often it's a family member. And I say, well, look, bring them along, dig them out, and let's share them. If they don't want to read it, then we'll read it for them. But quite often people can read it there and then, because these are the heart and soul of our generations that are being lost in the cupboards on the homesteads or the houses in town. And I love going to the second-hand bookshops, and I go straight to the book section and look for the little old battered Ed poetry books and find the little ones. But they actually made it to publish. People publish themselves. But there are some magnificent family stories and reflections written by people who never saw the sunshine of a spotlight, but are equally brilliant. And they're the ones that hopefully we can get people to bring out and share, and proudly share, in this informal meetings that we have.
After people have done the readings, do you discuss the poem at all?
If they wish, we will. We tend sometimes we'll sit with somebody if they want to and say, well, they'll say, well, how could I improve it? Now, none of us have got PhDs in poetry or anything like that. We've all got our English school backgrounds and that. But quite often we will discuss it to the level of, when was it written? What must they have been thinking? Was there anger? Was there sadness in it? Sometimes though people say, well, could we improve it? In which case it's their poem, so we don't do it. But we will say, well, maybe you might look at line 3, maybe that's a little longer. And there's all sorts of tricks that some words are very hard to rhyme with. I don't think he'd mind. I have a friend called Peter Oberhardt. Now, I do retirement poems, and trying to rhyme with Oberhardt was not good. But then I thought, okay, I'll call him Oberhardt Pete. Now, everybody knew who I was talking about, but I could rhyme with Pete. So there are little tricks like that you can do, which can make it flow easier or improve the image of the description. But there's no right and wrong way,
Yes. What about orange? Orange is notoriously hard to rhyme with, isn't it?
Orange, yes. Orange is one of those ones that you look at and think, orange, gorange. But you think, and I'll do it, I'll say, okay, if I've got to have orange, you could say the cart, it was orange. Well, I would tend to say, and he had an orange cart. And little tricks that I can use to get round it. They talk about in poetry a forced rhyme. So some words sound alike, but you're really pushing an accent on it to make it rhyme. And you can do that, but it obviously weakens the poem because you realise that, sky and Y sound the same. That's probably not a good example, but there are some where you think, oh yeah, that's sort of the same. But again, some poems I think too are better to read, and some poems are definitely better recited or performed, because the poet or whoever is performing it can put a heart and an accent into it. A friend of mine is putting some music behind my poems, not to make them songs, but the first time he did it, to me, it was like suddenly you put colour to a black and white photo. So, there's a lot of little things like that.
Yes, I want to talk about bush poetry and song, namely Slim Dusty and people like that in a little bit. But can we go back to your group? Tell me about some of the other people in the group who come to the meetings.
Okay, we have probably about 50-50, ladies and men. I'd say most of the men have got a bush background at some stage, like me, refugees from the bush, I reckon. But that said, I can think of 2 of them that spent their life working in and around Toowoomba area. One with the power companies, I think. The other fellow was with the railways. But then there's ladies there who, again, some of them have come from the bush. One lady's quite a bit younger than me still. She's very much a city girl and has a totally different generational idea to things, which is interesting because I often say we're children of our generation. And like it or not, we do take on our parents' background and things like that, which sometimes we rebel, but unfortunately as you get older you start to realise that certain characters don't disappear.
The apple doesn't fall very far from the tree.
Exactly.
You think that's what happens.
Yeah. So we've got one gentleman who comes from Warwick occasionally, we've got one from Dalby who comes in regularly, another one from Crow's Nest. But yeah, we're trying to reach out to people, retired people or people that are looking to become part of a group or just step out from home, but also to the younger people, because people say, oh, bush poetry belongs to an old era, and I said, well, it doesn't. A good young person has got just as much knowledge and power and understanding of his world today or her world today and bush poetry allows you to do that.
I'll just remind the listeners that they're on 4DDB and they're on Big Little Small Talk with me, Megan O'Hara-Sullivan, and today we're talking to bush poet Peter Frazer. Peter, what was the story that you told me about the older ladies who said, no, we're just here to listen?
Yes, well, we did have a group of ladies who came, and they came every month purely to listen. They said that they didn't want to read. One lady read occasionally, and she used to read some of the Shakespearean stuff. But basically, they said, no, we just, once a month, we like our little outing. We come down, meet with you, and they'd sit and listen to our poetry. And unfortunately, they pulled away once the COVID lockdown came, and really haven't come back because they're still probably a bit cautious about coming out to some things. But those rooms in the library are well ventilated and quite big, so I don't have a problem there.
So if people are interested in coming, do you have a Facebook page or a website? Or?
We do have a website, pardon me, Toowoomba Bush Poets. If people Google that, it'll come up. And the library itself, if people ring the library and ask, we'll just turn up and say, what room are the Bush Poets meeting?
You'll be able to hear them.
Yes, yes. Yeah, they'll say, oh, they're the noisy ones down
right,
in room 3, you know.
And you did tell me that you go out and you perform your bush poetry to some nursing homes and things, is that right?
We do. We go to a number of the nursing homes, Ozcare, Tricare, Lourdes, Clifton, from time to time. We've also done bush poetry events for Probus clubs, national seniors. So we love the opportunity to get out and to share our love of poetry. It's also then a good thing for some of the clubs to say, well, we'll have our lunch, we'll have our Christmas party, and we'll have some bush poets come along and entertain. And sometimes a group of us will come, sometimes just one or two. Like the Bull's Head Inn is a perfect location. That's a lost gem, that one, that beautiful old building there at Drayton. I defy anyone not to walk in there and feel the spirits of the past, you know. And we're going to next year, with their assistance, do some bush poetry there when people are there having a cup of coffee or something like that.
When you're performing at the nursing home, say particularly if people have dementia, do you find it sort of stirs a bit like music? It stirs something in them that your normal conversation doesn't? It's
interesting you'd say that, because I look around the room and, you know, people will assemble, and yesterday, for example, there was about 23 people there in various stages of health. And initially it can be quite staid, you know, when we're just there. But once you start, you'll start to see, particularly if there's a little bit of singing. We've got one gentleman joins us, he plays the guitar, and he'll sing some of Neil Diamond's or the Riders in the Sky and things like that. And you'll see a hand start to tap, or a foot start to tap, or, you know, a bit of a movement in rhythm. And by the time the 45 minutes is finished, I usually get George then to sort of do the closing thing with a couple of songs. And the difference in the faces and everything is quite astounding. But with the poems too, because a lot of people know, particularly the older traditional ones of Banjo Patterson, you can see them mouthing the words or acknowledging that that's it. But I like the poems, some of the poems I write, which are designed to make you go back in your mind, and you'll see them saying, oh yes, I remember that, you know, we had a string bag behind the door, you know. I call it your memory's gramophone. I wrote a poem along those lines where, you know, how often in life will you hear music or something said, and instantaneously, without trying, you'll be back at a place in time so vividly that you can quite often smell the flowers or whatever it was. And to me, that's your memory's gramophone doing it, and we all use it.
Have you got your memory's gramophone at the top of your mind to perform for me?
Yes. Play me a memory, the old man would say. Play me a memory as the sunlight slips away. Play me a memory and let my soul fly free. Play me a memory, the way things used to be. He'd sit beside the window as the sun began to fade and listen to the melodies on the gramophone he played. With a worn-out old needle on a scratchy 33, he'd sway to the music and he'd say to me, "The good Lord gave us many gifts and many precious things, and some will value diamonds and flashy golden rings. But by far the greatest gift that he did give to me was the love of a good woman and my memories." You will find as life goes on with all its ups and downs, that good friends will come and go as fortune does its rounds. And at times when you find your zest for life run low, simply find a quiet place and let the memories flow. For when I play that special song that we used to know, as the music fills my ears, into the past I go, and I can see her clearly and smell her sweet perfume, and as surely as the music plays, she joins me in the room. I can hold her in my arms and hear her softly say, "Hello, my darling, and how was your day?" And for a while it's as though the years have slipped away, and I recharge my batteries from my yesterday. Now the wheel of time has rolled and the old man is gone, but somewhere deep inside of me, his memory lives on. And at times when I find my zest for life run low, I pull out the gramophone and let the memories flow. And as the music fills my ears, I hear him clearly say, "Hello, young fella, and how was your day? And remember, no matter what, you need never be alone, for you can always dial me up on your memory's gramophone. Play yourself a memory at the end of the day. Play yourself a memory as the sunlight slips away. Play yourself a memory and let your soul fly free. Play yourself a memory of how things used to be."
Beautiful, Peter. Absolutely beautiful. Yeah. Did you always love poetry as a young boy? It's not a sort of a usual Aussie thing. It's that crossover between performing poetry, not a typical male, Australian male.
Yeah, it's interesting. I often think back on that. My parents always said I was a good mimic. I could learn off a little record and things like that, but there was no TV in the bush, so that was something to do. And I did always enjoy English, although some of my teachers didn't believe it, but and my marks may not have reflected it. But you're right, poetry definitely wasn't something that boys did, much less, adult men in the Australian bush. It was all right to sit and read, but you certainly didn't quote poetry. I suppose I started again through a bit of political satire. I realised that I could write things, and when I was driving around in the outback for several hours at a time by myself in the Channel Country, I would find myself running things through my head in the sort of words and things like that. Anyway, one day, one of my mates said, "Frazer, why don't you put it down on paper?" So I started, and again, it was more doing retirement poems for people when they retire, or people's golden wedding anniversary or something like that, 50th. And I used to say to them, "Give me the details and I will put it together in a poem." And that, between that and a bit of political satire, until you get old enough when you think, well, I don't really care what anyone thinks, I enjoy doing this, so I'll do it.
That's right, I'm going to do what I want.
Yeah.
Tell me about your working life. What sort of work have you done?
Well, I grew up in Western Queensland, a place called Cunnamulla. We were 2 hours from town on a sheep property, and I always say there was mum and dad, 5 kids, 2 dogs, and 3,000 rabbits. So it was an idyllic life in that respect. It was harsh, but we were completely isolated from the world. We had no idea about wars or, I did know that the wolves in Russia were the size of grizzly bears and would break the house down and eat you. I don't know where I got that, but that was about as much as I knew about the outside world. And then when we left the property in the 70s, I went through school here in Toowoomba, and I desperately wanted to go back to the bush. And I went to what was Gatton Agricultural College in those days and studied to be a stock and meat inspector. And my first posting in 1979 took me back to Cunnamulla, which was home territory. So that's when my career with the then DPI started, in the brucellosis TB testing of the cattle herds throughout the southwest right out to the South Australian corner. So I did that for many years and then got transferred eastwards, worked with the dairy industry and the cattle and sheep and pig industry on the eastern downs then with chemical residues and exotic disease prevention. And it was a really interesting life. There were times when it was pretty hard. I remember taking temperatures from a horse called Cugent, which was the stallion put down at Hendra when the Hendra virus outbreak occurred. We were all on the ground there that first week, and nobody really knew how dangerous it was. But I was down the Gold Coast working with the racehorses, the Magic Million sales, and the time of the fine cotton scandal. So, there was a lot of interesting things. My final years here in Toowoomba, I was the Registrar of Livestock Brands for Queensland. So I've always kept contact with the bush, even though I wasn't living there. And since retiring, I think that's probably my only regret, is that I'm losing contact with the people of the bush. But that's where this poetry stuff comes in, of course.
Have you been out travelling during COVID, going out west like everyone else in Queensland?
Well, we haven't done so much Western Queensland. We intend to again. But we did recently do the West Australian coast. So we flew over there and hired a car from Exmouth and drove down the West Australian coast to Perth. That was interesting. I was amazed to realise that if you've seen outback Queensland, you've seen outback Australia, because a large percentage of the Western Australian countryside was exactly like Cunnamulla or Thargomindah.
And during all those years working, you said that you were sort of making up poems as you were driving and things. The people that you were meeting, were you obviously putting them into your poetry as well? Yeah,
sometimes more so the characters rather than the individual. I do recognise some people. In one of the poems at the moment, I say any similarity is purely accidental, but I can see the characters in my mind's eye. But yeah, I think a lot of it is the events. Again, the logic, the sense of fair play, the sense of roguery, and the ability to say, let's make the best of what we've got.
Yeah. I've got a poem here in front of me called Matilda Weeping. Tell me about this poem.
Oh, right. This one I haven't learnt off yet. I've written it probably in the last 6 or 8 months. And it came from this discussion we're having now all around Australia of we can't get staff, particularly in the rural areas, but in the city areas and the country towns, we can't get staff. And I keep thinking, I took my first career postings to Western Queensland, which I loved, but I didn't say I must have a job in Brisbane or at the Gold Coast or Sydney or Melbourne. My wife was an accountant from Maryborough. She graduated in Toowoomba, and her first job was Cunnamulla. And she took it because she wanted a job. So at a young city girl of 21, she went to Western Queensland and lived in a pub. And that was an interesting experience in itself, apparently. But
I can imagine some of those drunks wandering upstairs.
Oh, yeah. The logic of this, I need a job, but I'll only do certain jobs, I'll only work there. And you think back to early Australia and the Depression years, and our parents and grandparents' years, they didn't have that luxury. And we can't put it all down to the fact that, it's the young ones don't want to work, or it's we don't have enough foreign workers. Because if that is the problem, then really we have got a problem that we're in big trouble with. So this poem I put down, which I called Matilda Weeping, and it sort of addresses some of those thoughts. Every year they come from the nations near and far to explore the Australian countryside and see just who we are. Like the swaggies of our past, you'll see them striding by with their youthful shoulders laden and their expectations high. They're the children of the planet, free from any nation's girth, the spirit of the future. They are the citizens of the earth. Their dress is often different and perhaps not still in style, but their backpacks are functional and can be used for quite a while. Some don't speak our lingo, but they're not afraid to try, and some speak better English than the likes of you and I. You'll find them in the vineyards and the orchards picking fruit, behind the bar in country pubs, or travelling en route. You'll strike them on our beaches, in our cities bright as well, and in our arid outback, where many folks won't dwell. And to our eternal shame, they bend their backs to work, labouring in the fields, doing jobs that Aussies shirk. It seems the Aussie character, a sunburnt, tanned, bushy, strong and sure, has faded into history, and in fact exists no more. No longer will he ride along as the droving cattle string, nor shear the golden fleece that our nation's wealth did bring. No longer will he pick the fruit beneath the Aussie sun. No longer in the vineyards does he work till harvest done. He's traded in the outback plains for a townhouse in Rose Bay, and a laptop and a mobile phone are his tools of trade today. He's moved to the big smoke, drinks latte, not billy tea, loves air-conditioned houses and lazing by the sea. He's retreated to the suburbs that line our nation's shore, and as the government closed down services that served the West before. So who will pick the harvest, and who will staff the bar, and who will venture westward to the inland towns afar? And who will take the baton from the pioneer's failing hand and continue with the labours that built this southern land? Now we rely on backpackers or refugees fleeing war to shoulder the tasks that our forebears did before. How can we hold our head up and proclaim our national pride if on the back of refugees and backpackers now we ride? Can't you hear Matilda weeping? Don't you hear the cooey call? Or is the suntown Aussie only legend after all?
Questioning.
Angry.
You were angry that day.
I was angry that day.
Oh, I think that's beautiful. When you were talking about the backpackers and people coming from other places, I was thinking about bush poetry and a documentary I'd heard on the radio last year sometime, I think it was, is about the sea shanties.
Yes.
Now, do you think bush poetry and the sea shanty is a similar type of thing? With sailors and whaling people and...
I think so. And it sort of reflected a culture, a work environment, and the people, again, of an era or a time. And with that, you see reflections of the feelings coming out in song or in poetry. And people, we talk about the sundowners, the swaggies. An interesting thing I heard recently, which I didn't know, where they claimed that the sundowner name was a derogatory thing because they were the people that turned up late in the afternoon looking for work, knowing that it was too late to get a full day's work. But again, those people walked from town to town. As a child, I remember the swaggies in the 50s, and we were 2 hours by car from town. So these, mostly men, but there would have been women, who couldn't get a job and had to do something, walked and door knocked the country places. And you imagine today saying to someone, do that?
Look, I remember in Tara in the 70s seeing swaggies there, so it's not that long ago.
No.
Yeah, exactly. I just going back to the sea shanties, that's more sort of, a lot of those are the call and response, aren't they? Whereas with the bush poetry, you don't have that call and response.
Yes, yeah. Again, I think the messages change with what's happening at the time. there's a lot of Irish and Scottish poetry, which reflect things like the clearing of the highlands and things like that, you know. And you look at some of the ones that are very religious Irish, and they were out of their belief and their culture, but also out of the hard existence they were trying to survive, you know. And the Irish roguery, you know, everyone knows an Irish joke, but the songs and that were the same, you know.
Just listening to you reciting Matilda Weeping, do you think a lot of bush poetry is about the class divide? Do you think that there's a lot of that?
It can be, pardon me. Definitely a lot of, you know, the early Henry Lawson stuff and things like that was about the class divide, I think. Probably because people could see it, but also it can be a way of saying this is wrong, this needs to be addressed. And again, sometimes people can say something in verse or in a song, and people will actually listen to it and take it on board, whereas if you stood up and said this at a public meeting, you'd probably be howled down by the people who don't agree with you. You know, I always say that everybody's entitled to their opinion. That if someone says I take offence with that, if I deliberately said something to hurt their feelings, that's one thing, and that's wrong. But if I say something that I believe is true, and somebody else says I object to that, then I think that is open for communication. It's when it's deliberately designed to hurt that's...
I like that thought that you can say things in a poem that you might not be able to say directly to a person. It's an interesting thing. You said something earlier which I found really interesting. You said this person who was putting some music behind some of your poetry, it was like bringing colour to a black and white picture or something to that vein. When I was doing some reading before I came here today, I was reading about the likes of Slim Dusty. I mentioned this earlier, and Where the Rain Tumbles Down in July.
Yes.
That's a sort of that's a bush poetry or a bush ballad put to music. Is there other instances, or what are some of your favourites, that Peter?
Well, I do love that one, but you're right. A lot of bush poetry, I believe, is a song is a poem put to music. If it's written with rhyme, and a lot of the modern songs that you hear, you know, Celine Dion and people like that, if you listen to the words, they quite often have the rhyme and metre of what we consider in bush poetry. They're not necessarily singing about a shipwreck or something like that, but quite often they are describing something or an emotion. But yes, The Rain Tumbles Down in July is a wonderful poem, because it's basically the description from a person watching it, but you get the feeling too of what that rain's going to mean, the sadness of the fact that the crops are going to be washed away. But you know, I love Hanrahan. Said Hanrahan, you know, the eternal optimist. We'll all be ruined.
Give me a little bit of that.
We'll all be ruined, said Hanrahan, in accents most forlorn. Outside the church ere mass began one frosty Sunday morn. The congregation stood around, coat collars to their ears, and yarned of stock and droughts and floods as they had done for years. It's looking crook, said Daniel Rook. Begad, it's crook, me lad, for never since the banks went bust have seasons looked this bad. It's dry all right, said young O'Neill, with which astute remark he squatted down upon his heel and chewed a piece of bark. And so around the chorus ran, it's keeping dry, no doubt. We'll all be ruined, said Hanrahan, before the year was out.
Completely unprompted, he just had that at the top of your mind. Oh, that's amazing. Now, unfortunately, what seems to happen with me is that I run out of time all the time. People like Cole Wilson, a.k.a. the Blue Shearer, is that right?
Yep.
Is he a contemporary, well-known bush poet?
He is. Well, there's numbers of them nowadays. Some people are more regularly heard of. They go to events and concerts and things like that. But then there's some that tend to move into the books or the CDs and that nowadays too, of course. The Australian Bush Poets Association I'm involved in, and they are wonderful in that respect because we often get reports or advertising of when some of these other poets are performing. And, you know, right around Australia, this booklet will talk about, every 2 months they send it out, but they put poems in there. They put obituary poems in for some of the best ones. This is the Tamworth event that's coming up in January. I'm going to go to that. I've always wanted to go to Tamworth, so I said, right, this is the year to go. But there'll be some very good poets at that.
Well, it's hot. I know that much.
Yeah,
I've been there in
it's
January, and it's hot.
It's
yeah.
hot in January.
And at something like that at Tamworth, would there be these open mic events where
There
people
is.
jump up?
Yes.
And will you do that, do you think?
I think I'll have a go. They have what they call the walk-ups, the open mics. So this one is Neil MacArthur is presenting it at the Long Yard Breakfast, and they have Bush Poet Breakfast from 8 till 10. That'll be on every day from Saturday the 14th, Sunday the 15th, Wednesday the 18th. So it's quite a few days. And then they have walk-ups, an open mic where they encourage people just to come up out of the audience.
Well, I loved earlier you said that slam poetry is really, it's a similar sort of thing. So I love the idea that at something like that there might be young people, older people, men, women, whatever. They all feel as though it's all love of the spoken word, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. And
Yeah.
it is. I mean, some people will say, oh, you know, I don't like that. And that's all right, because there's certain songs that you don't like too. But and there's certain paintings that you don't like. It's in the eye and the heart of the holder.
Very much so. Now, we're coming up to Christmas, and you've got a Christmas poem here for me. So can I hand that over to you? That's Christmas with a C. All right.
Another slightly political.
All right, we like the political ones. A bit naughty, yes.
The things that you can say when some people won't let you say it. So, I call this, that's Christmas with a C. It's Xmas time, the papers say, with all its grand to-do. There's coloured lights and tinsel string and fat old Santa too. The shops are full of sparkle, with bargains on every floor. So close the office, let's all go home, start walking out the door. But before you blow your budget on gifts large and small, just pause a moment to ponder on the meaning of it all. Is Christmas only presents all wrapped in tinsel bright? Is that really what it was all about on that first Christmas night, when wise men tracked a star to a stable dark and low? There were no fancy trimmings or Christmas trees aglow. Instead there was a manger and an infant child, you see, with a message of hope and love for all humanity. For Christmas is about families and spending time with friends, a time to show what's important and sometimes make amends. It's great to receive a card from folks you used to know, but maybe it's knowing that someone cares that lights that inner glow. The things that we really need are good friends, good health and love, and perhaps a little guidance from the good Lord up above. May good health travel with you as another year you see, and may the bluebird of happiness perch often on your tree. May those who you love dearly beat a track up to your door, and may the good Lord grant you all you are wishing for. So have a Merry Christmas with your friends and family, but always please remember, it's Christmas with a C.
I sometimes say to people, you know, that's a getting old statement, Peter, but I won't say that to you. Now, in my last few minutes before we have to say goodbye, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. What's the last thing that made you laugh out loud today?
I think we're seeing a video clip of a dog dragging his bed up towards the heater that someone had put on. And this sausage dog dragged the bed right across the room, put it in front of the heater the lady had turned on, and then looked up to check the heat was right before he hopped in.
Oh.
No, Yep.
So you're spending a bit too much time on social media,
I
I
think
gather.
so. Yeah, yeah.
What were you obsessed with as a child?
Well, as a child, growing up on a property, as I said, it was nature. My brothers and sisters and I, we knew what coloured egg all the birds laid eggs with, what nest material they used. We knew how many eggs a swan normally laid on a swan's nest in the middle of the lake. You know, we knew how many eggs the emus would lay and when they would lay. We knew, you know, when the kangaroos would start having joeys, and yeah, it was nature. Wonderful.
What a beautiful thought. I know you are a little bit political, a little bit controversial, but what would you say is your most controversial opinion?
Well, my wife would say I've got far too many, but I think when I say that you can't fix a problem or resolve injustice by rewriting history. That will not change what has occurred. It will only open up old wounds and create new divisions. However, if you ensure that you do something positive each day to make someone's life a little happier or a little easier, and speak up for injustice that's happening today, we will have a happier world.
So that doesn't sound terribly controversial. That sounds lovely, actually.
Yeah, it's amazing the people that will interpret it differently.
All right. What did you think the last time you looked in the mirror, Peter?
I can tell you exactly. I look in the mirror these days and I think, isn't it sad you can't get a good mirror or a good camera these days? But on that looking in the mirror, you may be aware of this poem, but I think it's one of the classics. I always had it up in my office and I share it with friends if they're having a bit of a hard time. It's a wonderful poem called The Man in the Glass, written by Peter Dale Windrow Sr. I actually think that the Alcoholics Anonymous use this as one of their genres too, but I'll just share it with you because I say to people, if you're feeling that, you know, you're not popular, you're bad, you've fought with your wife, go and have a look in the mirror in the morning and look at the person looking back at you, and if you can say that that person is a good person at heart, then don't beat yourself up. But if you look in the mirror and you see that person looking back at you and say, no, you're a bad egg, then you need to have a thought about how you're going to do it. And this poem basically says, when you get what you want in your struggle for self, and the world makes you king for a day, just go to the mirror and look at yourself and see what the man has to say. For he isn't your father, your mother or wife, whose judgment upon you must pass. The fellow whose verdict counts most in your life is the one staring back in glass. He's the fellow to please, never mind all the rest, for he's with you clear to the end, and you've passed your most difficult and dangerous test if the man in the glass is your friend. You may fool the whole world down the pathway of years and get pats on the back as you pass, but your final reward will be heartache and tears if you've cheated the man in the glass.
Beautiful. What a beautiful poem to finish our interview. I've only got two last questions, and it's the same questions that I ask everyone. If I was to ask you who your favourite royal is, Peter?
I should get my wife, she loves royals. I suppose I should say the princess in Norway because she's an Australian. But I still think of all of them, Lady Diana would have been the one that I would have given the jersey to. I think life was unkind to her in many ways, but she was a good-hearted woman, and people can say what they like about the royal family. They're stuck with it whether they like it or not, but I think Diana will go down in the histories as someone that was worth her wages.
That's beautiful. All right, now this is probably going to be a hard question for you to answer, but what's the song that can't keep you off the dance floor? Are you a dancing man or only a singing and reciting man?
No, I was a dancing man. But have you noticed that the brackets nowadays have got longer when you get on the dance floor?
Just perceptually, you think? Or?
I seem to be short of breath.
Yes.
But yeah, I suppose the best one I've always thought is I Knew the Bride When She Used to Rock and Roll by Nick Lowe. That great dancing song and a happy song too, you know.
Well, I'm going to ask that Leroy finds I Knew the Bride when she used to rock and roll, and I'm going to picture you dancing and reciting to that song, Peter.
Good on you.
Thank you so much for being my guest on Big Little Small Talk. It's
You're
been
welcome.
lovely to hear and be captivated by your reciting and taken somewhere other than where we are, although where we are in your beautiful home is lovely, right here on the range, listening to the birds and looking at the view. But it's just been lovely to be transported somewhere by your poetry this afternoon, Peter.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I do again invite people to come join us at the library for a bit of cup of tea and a bit of fun.
Wonderful. And I would encourage you to do it. I'm sure everyone would be welcome.
Yep,
yeah,
very
lovely.
much so.
Thanks again, Peter. That's it for this week. Thanks for joining me on Big Little Small Talk. I hope you can make the time to join me next week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast app.